I'm going to cover a methodology for undertaking a risk-benefit assessment of GMOs. You're probably familiar with how to do a risk assessment, but if not, I suggest you look at some of the other videos in this series that cover specific risk assessment examples. But have you ever considered what are the benefits of GMOs and how we might balance these with the risks? Perceptions of risk have tended to dominate the debate about GMOs. There's a general fear of the unknown and an idea that we're somehow interfering with nature. Then, if it's something that is produced by Monsanto or one of the other multinational companies, it must be bad. It's taking control away from the farmers, who will lose access to their traditional land races and who won't be able to save seed. On top of all that, do we really know what are the long-term effects and what are we really eating? If Europe and our other markets don't want GMOs, then we're going to lose exports too. Of course, there are answers to all these issues, but the fear-mongering plays into the hands of the anti-GMO activists. The perceptions of benefit have been less widely publicised, but benefits can be hugely important in the decision to adopt any new technology. Just look at cell phones as an example. People don't even consider the risks, they just see the benefits of owning one. The perceived benefits of GMOs are not always at a personal level like cell phones, but they affect society, agriculture and the environment in many ways. First, they can give higher yields than conventional crops, resulting in greater food availability. Then, they also contribute to sustainable agriculture, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and needing less pesticides. The next generation of GM crops will have nutritional improvements, such as higher vitamin A content. Then there's the potential to reduce or eliminate the need for tillage, which can significantly reduce soil erosion. The farmers can generate more profits while using fewer chemicals, resulting in a better environment for all. The trouble is that right now we have a standoff between those who are shouting the odds about the risks and those who are on the benefit side of the fence. We need a way for the two sides to move forward together. Unfortunately, up to now, the focus has been almost entirely on risk. Most countries, certainly in Africa, are signatories to the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, but this only talks about risk and risk assessment. Unfortunately, risk assessment only looks at the negative side of the equation. If we only thought about risks in everyday life, we'd never adopt anything new. We certainly wouldn't be driving in cars or flying in planes. The Cartagena Protocol is based on the precautionary principle, which has an exclusive focus on risk. To quote from the protocol, it says that where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. The protocol focuses on environmental issues, but the concept of the precautionary principle is carried over into issues of food, feed and socioeconomic issues. The problem is that the precautionary principle is inherently pessimistic regarding uncertain risks. So, if you're not quite sure, the message it puts across is that it's safer not to go ahead. The question, though, is that if there's no consideration of benefits, is any level of risk acceptable? It might be safer not to walk out of your house in the morning in case you get hit by a car. Oh, and you should avoid that hamburger because you might die of food poisoning. There must be a better way of looking at things. Well, there is another way. We don't have to focus only on the precautionary principle, where uncertain fear of serious harm calls for precaution. There is, in fact, something called the venture principle, which states that uncertain opportunity for benefit calls for positive action, in line with the common saying, nothing venture, nothing gain. Somehow, we need to make decisions based on a balance between these two concepts. Based on these two principles, we can consider risk and benefit as two sides of the same coin. So, where we might consider a hazard as something with the potential to cause negative effects, we can, on the other side, consider a positive effect with the potential to cause beneficial effects. A hazard can lead to harm, the degree of harm being the magnitude of the consequences if the hazard occurs. On the benefit side, we look at the magnitude of the consequences if the positive effect occurs. Then, while we consider the overall risk as a combination of harm and the likelihood of it occurring, we can, on the other side, consider the overall benefit as a combination of the potential benefit and the likelihood of it occurring. This then gives us a clear methodology we can follow to undertake a risk and benefit assessment. First, we identify and characterize the hazards and positive effects. We look at the likelihood of each of them materializing, and we assess the magnitude of the effect if each hazard or positive effect materializes. We can then characterize each of the risks or benefits in terms of the combined likelihood and magnitude. What enables us, though, to start to balance risks with benefits is that we can do this assessment semi-quantitatively. So, in an initial framing exercise, we would first identify all the hazards and positive effects that we need to consider. Then we would group them according to the area that they impact, whether environmental, agricultural, food-related, health-related, or socioeconomic effects. Let's go through some examples of the type of hazard or positive effect that we might decide to include. Starting with the environment, on the hazard side, we might consider whether herbicide-tolerant crops will increase the use of herbicides and lead to emergence of herbicide-resistant weeds. There might also be gene flow to weedy relatives of a crop that increases their fitness in the environment. Negative effects on non-target organisms are often considered, such as the debate about the impact of insect-resistant Bt crops on monarch butterflies in the States. By targeting lepidopteran pests with Bt crops, we might also see emergence of new pests. And in the southern African region, where water is scarce, more intensive farming practices might lead to increased water use. But on the positive side, we can envisage a shift to safer herbicides. For instance, atrazine is used extensively in maize cultivation, but it can pollute groundwater for up to 5 years. Glyphosate, or Roundup, used on herbicide-tolerant maize, degrades much more quickly in the environment. Any issue about human carcinogenicity of glyphosate would be dealt with under the health category rather than under environment, although I can mention in passing that the European Food Safety Authority has determined that glyphosate is unlikely to be carcinogenic. We can also envisage the positive effect of increased biodiversity due to reduced pesticide spraying, and the environmental benefits of being able to introduce low-till or no-till agriculture which preserves the topsoil and prevents environmental degradation. Where on the hazard side we can worry about increased environmental fitness of weedy relatives, on the positive side, in some instances there may be decreased fitness due to a higher metabolic burden. For instance, where plants are modified to be nutritionally enhanced. Then there are GM crops being developed with drought tolerance or salt tolerance, and these can have positive effects by reducing the need for irrigation. Of course, these are only examples and they're not intended to be exhaustive. Let's look next at some agricultural considerations. On the hazard side, we know that organic farmers worry about the hazard of cross-pollination from nearby GM crops. There's also the possibility that GM crops might not perform as expected. For instance, in Burkina Faso, there have been problems with the fibre length of the GM cotton crop, although this is most likely an issue related to conventional plant breeding rather than being a problem with the genetic modification itself. In the case of insect-resistant crops containing the Bt gene, most of these are targeted towards Lepidopteran pests. However, when farmers reduce their spraying regimes on Bt crops, this can leave the door open for secondary pests to proliferate. Then, another issue is the fact that farmers buy their GM seeds from a limited number of suppliers, and this in turn limits genetic variability, so that any new disease that comes along could be potentially devastating. And finally, there's the concern that farmers need to buy seed every year rather than saving seed. However, I should say that this is an issue that affects all hybrid seeds and is not just an issue with GM seed. But looking at the benefit side of the equation, firstly, it's well documented that farmers achieve higher yields and achieve greater profits from the use of GM crops. Some of the next generation of GM crops offer the promise of securing harvests in the face of climate change, with increased drought and heat in the southern African region. Spraying costs for the farmer are reduced, which is also a safety consideration due to reduced toxic sprays. And the weed burden is also reduced, which in many cases can free up time from manual weeding. The issue of low-till or no-till farming was listed already as an environmental benefit, but in fact it also has benefits to the farmer through reduced labour costs and retention of soil fertility in the soil. Depending on the particular case, food and feed safety can be considered either together with health or separately. In this particular slide, I've merged the two. One of the hazards that is normally considered in a risk assessment is whether the product of an introduced gene is toxic or allergenic, as well as whether there could be an increase in endogenous toxins or allergens. Another issue to consider is whether the GM crop requires processing in any different manner to the conventional crop, or whether there could be unexpected negative effects due to processing. And could there be any negative effects due to changes in the nutritional value of the GM food? Then what about agrochemicals that are used on the crop? I've already mentioned the debate about the safety issues of the herbicide glyphosate. But on the positive side, we can envisage that there could in fact be decreased risk of allergenicity or toxicity. For instance, scientists are looking at reducing the content of toxic cyanogenic glycosides in cassava. And the next generation of crops with enhanced nutritional value could have significant benefits in overcoming nutritional deficiencies. Then, some GM crops can also have increased shelf life and decreased pathogen contamination, as well as improved processing qualities. Many of these developments are still in the pipeline, but offer great promise for the future. It's also been shown that particularly for farm workers in developing countries who don't have adequate protective equipment, the reduction in the need for pesticide spraying has positive effects on their health and well-being. Socioeconomic considerations are not considered as part of the risk assessment in every country, and where they are considered, care must be taken to ensure that they do not sway decision-making based on hypothetical arguments. Some of the hazards that are often raised include the issue of control by multinational companies, so that the choices of farmers and consumers are reduced. Another issue is the concern that producers won't be able to export their produce, particularly to Europe. Another issue is the loss of traditional varieties of crops and of the associated indigenous knowledge. And the higher seed cost of GM seeds can act as a barrier for small-scale farmers, particularly where they can't access credit facilities. But again, there are positive effects here. Although there is much talk against the multinationals, they are able to ensure a reliable supply of high-quality seed. And use of GM crops by smallholder farmers can lead to improved livelihoods and associated cultural benefits, linked to increased income for both commercial and small-scale farmers. And the increased yields associated with growing GM crops lead to more affordable and good quality food in the shops. Once all the relevant issues to consider for a particular assessment have been determined, we can move on to do an actual semi-quantitative risk-benefit assessment. In brief, each hazard or positive effect is scored according to various criteria. The A group of criteria are ones that are of importance and can individually change the assessment, while the B group are criteria that are of value but not individually capable of changing the assessment. Each hazard or positive effect is then assigned a probability factor based on the likelihood of it materializing. So, we use a scoring system as follows. For the A criteria, firstly, how important is the impact of the hazard or positive effect? This scores from 0, unimportant, to 4, very important. Secondly, how big would the change be? This scores from -3 for a negative change to +3 for a positive change. Then, for the B criteria. Firstly, how susceptible is the affected environment or population? Secondly, how reversible is the impact? And thirdly, to what extent is the impact cumulative or synergistic? All of these score from 1 to 3. And finally, we give a probability factor that ranges from 0, impossible, to 1, certain. So then we get into a bit of maths. For each hazard or positive effect, we calculate by multiplying the two A scores with the sum of the B scores, and then multiplying again by the probability factor. We can then calculate an overall score for each category, such as environment, by adding the scores for each hazard or positive effect and dividing by the total number of scores. We do the same for each category, then add these together, give an overall risk-benefit score, or RBS. A positive score would indicate that benefits outweigh the risks, whereas a negative score would suggest that risks outweigh the benefits. It might be that you decide that one category is more important than another, for instance that food safety is more important than the environment, or vice versa. In this case, you can add weightings to each category, but this should be done right at the start to avoid the possibility of manipulating the answer by introducing bias retrospectively. This is just to give you a couple of examples of how the final scores turn out. The first one was an assessment of BT maize in South Africa, where the overall scores in all the categories were positive. Then, we did an assessment of the risks and benefits of growing GM rice containing lactoferrin and lysozyme to treat oral diarrhea in infants. In Peru, where there are no wild relatives of rice, the assessment came out marginally positive. This is compared with Burkina Faso, where there are wild relatives, and the assessment is marginally negative, the difference being in the environmental score. The negative agricultural score was based on the risk of value loss to conventional rice due to cross-pollination from the GM rice, although it should be possible to find ways to control this. So how far are we from putting this system into practice? Well, the first step is that legislative systems in countries need to acknowledge the need for benefits to be considered as well as risks. There's nothing to stop this being done, but countries need to take the concept on board. Then, the regulatory processes need to include an initial framing step, where the hazards and benefits that are to be considered are discussed and agreed ahead of the assessment. This isn't always the case, and certainly from my knowledge of the South African regulatory processes, for one, it is not the case. And finally, decision-making needs to be based on objective criteria, not on views and opinions that are not backed up by any real information. This isn't really anything new. Already back in 2010, the Academy of Sciences of South Africa already stated that, and I quote, In order to evaluate GM crops, an evaluation of their potential benefits must be made, in addition to an evaluation of the potential damage to human health and the environment. This methodology provides one way in which this can be brought into practice in an objective manner. Finally, if you would like to read up on the details of the risk-benefit analysis methodology, I refer you to my published paper in Transgenic Research, shown here. If you can't access the paper through your library, please feel free to email me and I will send you a copy. Thank you.